आजादी के अमृत महोत्सव के अंतर्गत प्रस्तुत है हमारा आज का ये विशेष कार्यक्रम, जिसे सुनकर के आपका सीना भी गर्व से ऊंचा हो जाएगा।
नमस्कार श्रोताओं, 90.8 मेगाहर्ट्ज पर ये रेडियो आजाद हिंद का प्रसारण है।
आमने सामने।
श्रोताओं, आज का कार्यक्रम बेहद खास है। इस कार्यक्रम में हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं वरिष्ठ लेखक कवि उदयन वाजपेयी जी, जो कि साक्षात्कार कर रही हैं जर्मनी हेडलबर्ग से पधारी गीता धर्मपाल जी से। गीता धर्मपाल जी इतिहासकार हैं और गांधी रिसर्च फाउंडेशन जलगांव में प्रोफेसर हैं। आइए हम उदयन वाजपेयी जी से अनुरोध करते हैं कि वो इस साक्षात्कार की शुरुआत करें।
The great historian of India, Dharampal, and Bhopal is very fortunate to have his daughter in our city, and so we intend to. And she's Geeta Dharampal, and she was a professor in the Heidelberg University in Germany for many, many years, and she's a great historian in her own right. And now she lives in Jalgaon. She works in Gandhi Peace Foundation there, Gandhi Research Foundation there, and we will today try and see that what was the basic intervention of Dharampal's work, historical work, in our understanding of the past of India. So, I would like Geeta to start by, speaking her initial comments, if she can.
Yes, well, my father was not born a historian. He was not even trained as a historian. He had started a degree in physics. And he left this to join Mahatma Gandhi's Quit India movement in 1942. But then after independence, he was a little disillusioned by the way things were taking shape in Nehruvian India, felt that Gandhi's understanding of Indian traditions were being set aside, and that India was not really coming into its own. And he realized that the developmental policies that were being introduced by Nehru were not really applicable to India, were not appropriate. They did not have that much impact on society and the people, and were not bringing about any real change. Of course, like the general idea was that maybe India was not mature enough, was not able to deal with modernity. But my father had always been very critical, had a critical mind, an original way of thinking, and he felt that ordinary Indians were just as capable as people anywhere in the world, and that maybe the problems that that India was confronting in the 50s and 60s were due to the colonial influence, the colonial legacy, colonial structures that were still being continued in the administration and politics, and that the general view that India, prior to the European conquest, to the British conquest, that India at that time was declining, and that it was the British takeover was in a way a good thing, because they brought modernity to India, and otherwise India would have just stagnated. He questioned this. I think basically he had great faith in the Indian ethos, Indian traditions, very similar to Gandhi. He was influenced by Gandhi's understanding of village India, in that he expresses, that Gandhi expressed in 1909 in Hind Swaraj,
Yes.
that that Indian civilization was really the best civilization in the world. I mean, that it was still existing, and that the people of India were not really touched. The ordinary people were not really touched by Western civilization. That was, or modern civilization. That was at the beginning of the 20th century.
If I just may intervene a bit, because in the last years of his life, he had come to Bhopal. He used to come to Bhopal quite often anyway. So once he told me that he's going to meet the chief minister, who was a woman those days, chief minister, and he went to see her. And his idea of going there was that he wanted the government to be withdrawn from a block or two of this estate, because he actually believed that if the villages are left to their own means to govern, they have this in them, the capacity to rule themselves. Because that was the very fundamental idea that, and you very rightly said, that because this is a very fundamental to the understanding of the Dharampalji's work and his relationship to Mahatma Gandhi in that sense, that the villages of India, they have the, potential to create, to rule themselves, to create their own models of ruling and administrating themselves. So these were in fact, this is one of his last desires, that if we can just start experimenting at a very small level. But actually,
Yes.
my critique of that was, at that time I said that, if something of this sort happens, and if it succeeds, then the whole modern nation state that India has erected, what you call Nehruvian model, which everybody in India who rules follows, has followed up to now,
Yes.
would collapse.
Yes. Yes. He was also somewhat of an iconoclast.
Yes.
He felt that about 20% of the people of India, one could do away with them. He would talk in rather radical terms. He was by no means non-violent or anything. By no means violent, but he
Yes.
could be very radical in his views. But what I was trying to show is that his deep belief in the functioning, in the capability of
Yes.
Indian social life to function in a reasonable way.
Yes.
That was quite deeply ingrained. And then he did some work in the early 60s or mid 60s in Tamil Nadu
Yes.
on the
Panchayati,
panchayat
yeah.
system.
Yes.
And he came across a lot of very interesting colonial records on the panchayat system. But his real work, by looking at these records, he was able to see how the village, the rural setup functioned, and how the rural economy was structured, which was really quite self-sustainable, and was very, very complex, but which allowed for the sustenance of all the communities, and this notion that there were great sections of Indian rural communities who were marginalized, destitute, and that did not seem to be the case. This was perhaps a post. It happened after, say, around the 1830s, 1840s, after the major regions of India were then colonized, and through the excessive land tax and also the wars that were being waged in the various regions that caused great destitution and marginalization, and then also led to a change in the social structures, which was also brought about by an intellectual intervention on the part of the early British Orientalists, where
Yes.
they use a sort of theoretical understanding of Indian society.
Yes.
The Manu Smriti, or the Manu Dharma Shastra, which describes the fourfold Varna system,
Yes.
and they take it to be sort of the
Template.
the template for understanding reality.
Yes.
And this was began then to be used as as a description of so-called Indian caste society.
Yes.
And this, I think, then also influenced the sort of Western educated, and then administratively it was applied during the census of India,
Yes.
where caste groups were being categorized
Yes.
according to their Varna adherence.
Yes. Yes.
But after doing this preliminary research in the Tamil Nadu State Archives, which are one of the best organized archives in
Yes.
in India, apart from of course the National Archives and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, but my father was then able to do research work in London itself,
Yes.
in the old colonial archives of the India Office Library,
Yes.
and then the British Library, then also the Scottish Archives, to a certain extent also in other university archives. And he became, there he started learning the craft of a historian. And he went into these archival records by the colonial authorities. You see, the colonial officials used to write really detailed reports of everything they saw,
Yes.
everything they did. Also because they needed to get it needed to be sanctioned by the British authorities that were based in London, they were. The earlier reports, say from the late 18th century,
Yes.
were reporting about various practices, like scientific practices,
Yes.
like
Tika.
the
vaccination.
inoculation,
Yes.
the smallpox inoculation,
Yes.
that was being practiced quite widely in regions of Bengal,
Yes.
and was quite successful.
Yes.
Then there was the production of iron and steel,
yes.
in small sort of
Furnaces.
that
Yes.
were mobile, that could be carried
Yes.
from place to place.
They were
And they-
agarias.
Yes.
They were communities.
There were communities,
Agarias.
yes,
That
and
used to
this
do
the steel being produced
Yes.
was described as representing the best steel, which was
Yes.
it was equated to the Swedish
Yes.
steel,
Yes.
which was considered to be the best in
Best.
the world
Yes,
at that
yes,
time.
Yes. Yes.
Then there were also other practices like surgery, plastic
surgery.
surgery, evidences of a nose that was
Being
then reconstructed.
Yes.
Then there were agricultural techniques like the drill plow.
Yes. Yes.
And then also astronomy and mathematics.
Did he found the papers, in the British medical journals written around those researches? Because in one of the texts, if I remember rightly, Dharampal ji has reproduced in one of the books, the report from a journal, medical journal, where the stika, the inoculation thing, was being reported by an ambassador, wife of the ambassador of Turkey, the English ambassador's wife in Turkey,
Yes.
to his to some person in England,
Yes.
and saying that here the people come and they go from door to door inoculating, and that's
Yes.
what they call tika.
Yes. Yes.
And wherever those reports were such, I mean, those
Yeah,
copies.
these reports were also in the India Office Library.
Okay.
I mean, yes,
Okay.
and this one detailed report was by a sort of a temporary governor of St. In Kolkata.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The late 18th century.
Okay. Okay.
But this was then taken up by British scientists,
Okay.
and
Yes. Yes.
then vaccination, which were there, instead of taking it from the inoculation, the substance from an already infected person, it was taken from the cow.
Yes.
So that's why the term
The shift.
vaccination.
Yes, the shifted.
Yeah, it's shifted. But the actual scientific principle was
Already there.
Was already there.
And so was of plastic surgery, for that
of,
matter.
of
Yes,
plastic
of course.
surgery as well. Yeah. So and these reports were then assembled together, and it became the first book that was entitled Indian Science and Technology in the 18th century.
Yes.
And what most of his publications have a documentary section. The major part of the book is a documentary section with first-hand reports of any practices.
Yes.
And it's preceded by a long introduction by him,
Yes.
sometimes 50, sometimes 100 pages,
Yes.
where he's explaining the context, the historical context, its significance, and then the repercussions and the conclusions that can be drawn from this material. So it leaves room for the reader to really see what the actual historical data is.
Yes.
You know, there's no tampering with the data, and yet you can understand its how to understand it too. I mean, the context is given.
Is there a precedence of that kind of history writing in let's say, in the European tradition? You know, that where you produce this big amount of data and then write an introduction to that?
Probably.
I mean, is there somebody there?
I don't think he was copying anybody.
No, not copying. But, is there anybody who does it in this way that he did? Because what he was doing, that he was just keeping the material open for anybody to write his or her own introduction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is as if that he is not hiding anything.
Yes.
He's just keeping, it's like a chessboard.
Yes.
And he wrote his moves, that this is how I sought these things, For example, in the the Panchayat studies, he says that, he concludes that, in India, therefore, the revenue collection was decentralized. It was not as if all the money, the revenue was collected and was going up a central treasury or something like that, and from there it's being given to to the smaller units. It's completely not like that, and that he understood by the data that he studied in Tamil Nadu and later also. So but he produces that data along with his conclusions.
Yes.
So it was for anybody to play his own game.
Well, in a way, this is really scientific research because you should be transparent.
Absolutely.
And I mean, a piece of a PhD always has a lot of references.
Absolutely.
You have to state, where you have got your material from, whom it was being used by before, or but the fact that he presents the empirical data, the first-hand material. Is in the scientific tradition, but it's not unknown. I mean, editions of literature or texts would often be like this. You would have for instance, of great poets or dramatists. You would have their writings, but with a long introduction then by the person who's putting it together.
Yes.
So, but doing this with historical documentation, I think, is perhaps even more worthwhile.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would think that he, in a sense, to my mind, that's what I was coming to.
Yes.
That he really invented a new way.
Yes.
I mean, not maybe completely new or something, but he must have taken ways from
Yes.
certain some inspirations from here and there, but he ended up creating a new way of writing history.
Yeah.
And that makes it difficult for the academic historians here who are in habit of writing the history in a certain prescribed template, as if
Yes.
to accept the masterly work of Dharampal.
Yes.
Because he, in a sense, proposes a new way of writing, which I
Yes.
think is far more useful
Yes.
and fertile
Yeah.
for a colonized country like India. I mean, the post-colonial
Yes.
India,
Yes. And I think this is true. And he was looking at certain topics that he felt were of relevance
Yes.
for the then contemporary India. So Science and Technology was
Yes.
the one book. Then there was the Civil Disobedience in the Indian Tradition.
Yes.
And this was a collection of documents again about a resistance movement
Yes.
that took place in the Banaras region in 1810 to 11. It
Started from Bhagalpur.
Yes, it was in reaction to a new house tax that
Yes,
was being
yes.
imposed by the British,
Absolutely.
which the inhabitants felt was unjust,
Yes.
and that it was not necessary. And so they petitioned the authorities. They explained that this is not necessary, and when their petition doesn't succeed, they go on a mass protest.
Yes.
And then this protest is being described by the British officials, the way the people congregate, the way they try and negotiate, then the stoppage of work. I mean, all types of workers are stopped for not just the Banaras region. It goes up to Bihar, up to Patna, more or less. That even dead bodies are no longer being cremated.
Yes.
And this lasts for about a good part of a year.
Yes. That's true.
And it is only ended then by violent measures, the police measures by the colonial authorities.
Yes.
And he says that in his introduction, he says, he calls it civil disobedience in Indian tradition. And his basic thesis is that Gandhi's notion of satyagraha is considered to be to have different origins.
Yes.
One is that it was Gandhi's own invention.
Yes.
Others is that he got it from Thoreau or
Yes.
from Tolstoy.
Yes.
But what my father then sees from the documentation, the historical documentation, is that this was considered to be a practice
Yes.
that was quite had quite a long genealogy in Indian society, and that Gandhi also recognized this. I mean, he mentions this in Hind Swaraj, where he says that when people, villagers, felt that the law, some unjust law was being promulgated by the local prince.
Yes.
The people would then start vacating
the
village, and the prince then becomes nervous. and retracts.
Yes.
And Gandhi says this is real Swaraj, and that this satyagraha was always practiced. So in a way, what Gandhi is doing, he's trying to reinvigorate a traditional practice that was considered to be a moral right of all citizens, and not just a moral right, but also a moral duty that you, as a citizen of a country, you have the duty to oppose any unjust law. And rulers in the traditional system recognized this, because there was a kind of an understanding that the notion of the functioning of Indian polity was shared by both the rulers and the ruled.
Yes.
And there was a balance. So one would negotiate then.
Yes.
And the Indians under British rule, they felt that at the beginning at least, they felt that they would be able to negotiate their position. But the British were not willing to do this, for they said that they were subjects, and subjects, the role of subjects is to obey.
Yes.
They can't negotiate. They are not on. You can't see eye to eye. You're not on the same level.
Yes.
And so, in the introduction, there's this very interesting understanding or description of Indian polity.
Yes.
That there was a balance between the rulers and the ruled,
Yes.
and that negotiation was part of any kind of, was considered to be an important part of the organization and the structuring of polity. And that this is what becomes weakened and vanishes, and which Gandhi tries to revive in the 20s and 30s.
No, in fact, he... I don't remember if he has written it somewhere, but in our discussions, one thing he would repeatedly say, that the distance between the state and the people has continuously increased.
Yes.
And when it goes on being increased, then the negotiating possibilities are reduced. And with the entry of the British, even slightly before that, not many centuries, but few centuries, a century or so, 17th century or so, the British enter, the distance between the people and the state has already getting increased. And finally, the people in India, they take some time to recognize that they are no more part of that state where the distance was not so big. So that difference we must recognize. And Gandhi was one of those persons who proposed the way to undo it.
Yes. Yes.
And Dharampal ji tries to underline that.
Yes.
That the theory of state that Gandhi is proposing, the oceanic theory, that theory is important.
Yes.
And that he proposes in Roundtable Conference, and Dharampal interprets it.
Yes.
I mean, Gandhi only refers to that. He has never explicitly said it.
Yes. I think it's important to mention a few other aspects.
Yes.
And one is that of the notion of education.
Yes.
The practice of education. It was considered, it was a sort of conventional assumption that India was not really that educated. Maybe it had been in ancient times, but it was the British who introduced education, modern education into India. Then again, my father was contesting this, and he discovers a whole lot of material from different parts of India, also again written by Britishers, where they're discussing the practice of instruction, educational instruction that is being done in a systematic way in the southern part of India, in the Tamil region, in Bengal, in Kerala on the western coast, in Punjab, so in various regions of India. And it's estimated that more or less in every village there was a school.
There were 2 schools every 3 villages.
Or 2 schools in every 3 villages. And these schools were being financed by the local resources of the village, so the village economy. And the children that were attending these schools, so young girls aged 8 to 15 or so, were being educated, were receiving an education for about 6 to 7 hours a day in these local institutions that were locally funded. And this represented something that was of interest to the colonial officers, because this was something that was not being practiced in England at the time.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, of course, one had these elite institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, but the general elementary education was restricted basically to Sunday schools. You know, about an hour or so of instruction after the Sunday service, the Sunday religious service in the church, and British education only really became developed then and more widespread after about 1815, 1820.
Yes.
So India did represent quite a well-organized, well-functioning educational system. And it was Gandhi's comment after or around the time of the Second Round Table Conference, when he gave a speech at Chatham House, he mentioned that India was more literate 150 years ago than it is now. That was in 1931. And a person called Philip Hartog, who was in the colonial service, he questioned this. He said, "I don't believe this. Give me proof." And Gandhi at that time was too busy. He couldn't really produce this. But he said that the beautiful tree, meaning the sort of the schools, the local schools, was that one dug at the roots. The British dug at the roots. And laid them bare, and the tree withered. And these schools disappeared. Disintegrated. And this was a result of British, the colonial economic practice, taxation basically, where all the resources at the local level were drained off. You see, before the coming of the British, about at least half the resources or more that were gained from the harvest the proceeds of the harvest would remain at the local level, or two-thirds. Two-thirds, yes. And this was then being drained off, so there was no financial resources for these cultural and educational institutions, and also for the technologies that were being practiced that I described earlier. So that it didn't disappear immediately, but within the course of, say, 50 to 80 years, then these institutions dwindle and disappear. And then other missionary schools are then introduced. And there is perhaps one other, of course, he's also written about Gandhi, but that is perhaps not so historical. But there's perhaps one interesting book which is called Bharat Chitmanas and Kal.
Yes, that's an important book.
Yes, it's an important book. It's about India's understanding of time. How India's position in the modern world. That one has this notion of the four yugas, and each yuga is one of decline. Now, in the fourth yuga, the Kali Yuga, in which we're living now, the bull Dharma, he's standing on just one leg. And that these the modern technologies that we consider, that in the West at least are considered as progress, are really there to make life bearable, to make it sort of because the notion of morality and that is just so low that at least we should have some sort of material comforts, but that these modern technologies are not of that much value in themselves. So this notion that the Indian mind, the traditional understanding, sees them as appliances to make life a little bit easier to live, but they are not per se of real value. And so India's the traditional Indians or the ordinary Indians' understanding of modernity is different from that of a Western person. And therefore one is not really latching on to
yes,
modern developments, and because one doesn't consider it to be something that should be attained, that
Yes,
is a
yes,
goal in
yes.
life.
That's not aspiration.
Yes. So I think this is something this needs to be gone into in more detail, but I think it's an important philosophical understanding.
Yes.
That shows that ordinary Indians, they can deal with sort of modern implements, but they don't consider it as something to which to strive for.
Yeah, that's true.
This was written in the late 90s, huh?
Late 90s,
yes.
yes.
Now, maybe now in this computerized age, he may have written differently, but
Yes, but the 30 years are too much.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and another thing that we should say, since we're in Bhopal, an institution has been set up. It was set up in 2009, called the Dharampal Shodh Peeth, the Dharampal Research Institution, and they're the recent chairperson, Shri Dhruv Shukla, is really wanting to initiate a lot of research along Dharampalji's lines, maybe some relating also to research that he has started but needs to be pursued further. He's getting in touch also with universities here. We've just had a function at the Bhopal BU
Barkatullah
University,
Yes.
and it was attended by the Minister of Higher Education, and I think this is just the first of many in such events. And I too, being now based in Jalgaon at the Gandhi Research Foundation, I would like to link up with the Dharampal Shodh Peeth, and because we also have some original documentation that has not yet been sort of looked at, relating to my father's archival research and other things that I feel need to be studied more carefully. Yes. And I think there is a lot of material and data for young students, and I think my father did become a kind of cult figure.
Yes.
So it would be good if his interest, he felt that whatever he had done was just a beginning.
Yes.
That he was looking at India's recent past through the eyes of Europeans. Now, they had written, so in a way, whatever is written is not exaggerated, because it's being written by observers who are trying to find out more about Indian society, but they wouldn't necessarily exaggerate.
Yes.
But if Indians were to write about, if one was to look at Indian records, one would get a much more an inside perspective about the functioning of Indian society.
Yes.
And this is work that needs to be done. And he believed that there was enough manuscript wealth in India, in various depositories, that should be looked into. And I think this is something that needs to be pursued. It could be PhD programs at regional universities, that one understands one's regional history much more, in much greater detail and depth. And also another area that he did just initiate was the connections of India within Asia.
Yes.
So especially with Southeast Asia and East Asia, he felt that needed to be looked into more detail. And there one could also set up links with Southeast Asian scholars, East Asian scholars, because this the Asian cooperation or the interaction was quite close. I mean, until about the 18th century, there were very close contacts in culture, economics, politics, and this was then disrupted due to the India being colonized. I mean, it was really cut off then from its neighbors.
I think it was cut off, I mean, basically the problem was that when the world gradually became Eurocentric, I mean, Europe or America, they tried to mediate every relationship. Every
Yeah.
two countries were related through them.
Yes.
And Dharampal ji was actually thinking about that how can we think about a bigger picture of the world, which was before the Eurocentricity was, the centrality of the Europe was established. And you are right that to start with, we should have something to do with the Asian interrelationships, and then we go farther. Why? Because he was very deeply interested in that voyage, these fleet of the Chinese
Yes,
going to
yeah,
America and
yes.
discovering America much before Columbus.
Well,
and,
maybe not discovering America, but yeah, I mean, that
But
was...
there's a book.
Yeah, but that is perhaps exaggerated. I think even the Chinese don't admit that. But
Yes.
but there was certainly contact. This is Chang Ho,
Yes.
this Chinese admiral,
Yes.
who had about there were 7 to 8 expeditions that came to the East Coast,
Yes.
also something to Bengal, and especially to the West Coast.
To Calicut.
To Calicut, yeah. And there was a whole fleet of ships.
317.
Something like that,
Yes,
yes.
18,000 people.
And there would be not just sailors on it. There would be
all kinds.
lots of scientists, pharmacologists,
Chroniclers.
doctors, mathematicians, astronomers. So there was obviously an interest in interacting
Yes.
with similar, with their counterparts
Yes.
in these coastal areas.
Yes, yes.
And one knows about certain developments in mathematics,
Yes.
especially in the Kerala region,
Yes.
in around the 14th, 15th century.
Yes.
So I want to pursue that. I think that really needs to be understood. Looked into in more depth. One talks about certain changes that occur in India due to European contacts, but one hasn't looked.
Reverse.
Yeah, but one should look at
Yes.
changes or mutual enrichments that take place due to inner Asian contacts,
Yes, yes.
interactions.
Like, for example, the linear perspective in the painting has come out of the number theory.
Yes.
Number theory has traveled from the Silk Route.
Yes,
Now, this
yes.
is quite well established.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
उदयन वाजपेयी जी और गीता धर्मपाल जी, आप दोनों का ही बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद कि आप रेडियो आज़ाद हिंद के स्टूडियो में पधारे और आपने हम सभी के साथ इतिहास की इतनी महत्वपूर्ण जानकारियां साझा की। श्रोताओं, आप अभी सुन रहे थे कार्यक्रम आमने सामने। इस कार्यक्रम को अब हम यहीं विराम देते हैं। हमें अनुमति दीजिए। नमस्कार और सुनते रहिए 90.8 मेगाहर्ट्ज पर रेडियो आज़ाद हिंद, देश का चैनल, देश के लिए।
आमने सामने। अभी आप सुन रहे थे आजादी का अमृत महोत्सव के अंतर्गत हमारा आज का ये विशेष कार्यक्रम।